So welcome everyone to the second seminar for GCSJ's monthly research seminar series. Today we have Alessandra Marino, who's presenting a paper entitled Space in Common, Property, Waste and Their Colonial Lives in the Cosmos. My understanding is that this paper has been accepted for publication and will be coming out in Theory, Culture and Society at some point over the next few months, but we don't know yet what the date would be. So I will hand over to Ale, and Ale will speak for about 30 minutes or so, and then we will have about 20 to 30 minutes of Q&A following the presentation. Over to you, Ale.
Yes. Hi, everyone. Thank you very much for coming. It's nice to see some friendly faces. I am presenting this talk, which is like a shorter version of a paper that I have written and has been accepted in a special issue for Theory, Culture and Society. So I'm happy to discuss, like inevitably, because of the kind of the passage between writing and presenting, some of the things will have to be kind of shortened, and I'm happy to take them up and expand on whatever becomes a little bit unclear because of brevity in the Q&A. The title of this talk is a little bit grand in terms of like having sort of like a reference point in the cosmos. However, the reality is that today I'm going to talk quite specifically about mega constellations and debris in low Earth orbit, and the idea and the construction of the legal construction of the geostationary orbit. So and also this paper kind of like does quite a bit of like context setting. So please, I hope you'll bear with me in that sense. But that's not only because of the way the paper is set up, it's because the broader field of studies, which is emerging of the social studies of outer space, I feel is in that space in which it's kind of like starting to build itself and build a number of conversations with other fields of the social sciences. And I'm contributing to that by bringing together conversations with political ecology and postcolonial studies. That's just a bit of setting up my stool. Can you see the change in the slide? Perfect, thank you. So I'll start in very OU style with a bit of a vignette. So, and I'll read from it. Shortly after leaving Georgetown for the Amazon rainforest in the interior of Guyana, the town of Linden starts to appear at the horizon. Wide, spread out, a skyline of flat and gently sloping roofs. Approaching the Demerara River, the mirror image of a bauxite factory appears in the calm waters. White smoke powerfully pumped out from the exhaust contrasts with the stillness of the river. I look down and then up. The environmental degradation from the stripping of layers of soil seems to meet the air and water pollution resulting from industrial processes. I was traveling to the Amazon rainforest for a project on the use of satellite technologies for environmental monitoring. And this is the picture that I took. I had previously only seen this area through maps enabled by satellites. These aluminum boxes made of bauxite, maybe the same bauxite, embody environmental relations that stretch from soil to the atmosphere and all the way to orbit. There are almost 10,000 satellites encircling our planet, and about half of these are owned by a US-based commercial company, SpaceX. Their occupation of orbit represents yet another dimension, unseen, hence underappreciated, of the environmental crisis. Satellites and space junk, as I discussed in this talk today, are harmful to communities and the environment because of the earthly extractive economies that produce it, that the changes to the dark sky that they engender, and because of the possibility of collisions and debris re-entering Earth. In Linden, in Guyana, the relation between exploited land and more than terrestrial pollution appeared as neat as the mirror image of the steaming bauxite factory in the river water. So I start from here in this talk to weave together critiques of the uses of orbital space and changes to the night sky by focusing on the role of private property in shaping current inequalities in space access. So the aim of this talk is dual. First, I try to analyze how property, which is often dismissed as irrelevant to outer space, because it's a deterritorialized domain, and we'll see a little bit more about that. Property is instead central to understand the coloniality of neoliberal space activities. And secondly, I want to foreground in this talk activist calls for protecting orbits and extraterrestrial environments as commons in the context of building future and more just ecological relations. So let's start a little bit from the the context. I said that property is often kind of like considered not particularly important when we're talking about outer space. And the idea of the commons is kind of like related to that. The Outer Space Treaty, which is the main tool through which space is governed, rejects state sovereignty claims in space and upholds principles of collaboration and reciprocity. This is sometimes read as an endorsement of looking at space as a commons. However, the debate is open, and in 2020, there was an executive order of President Donald Trump that explicitly stated the United States does not view space as a global commons. The US Artemis program at the same time also opened up the possibility to extract and commercialize lunar regolith, creating a context in which, while sovereignty is denied, that denial coexists with the possibility of occupying space. So it is in this context that I am proposing that the idea of space commons is important, but it can only be effective in challenging what I'm going to call, for the rest of this talk, cosmic capitalism, using an expression created by Peter Dickens. Only if room is made to reckon with the complex interaction between exploitative environmental processes that underpin the production of debris and the use of property as a tool for establishing the right to use and waste space. So I don't only look at the coloniality of space activities, but also I look at current work on decolonizing the commons. And I suggest that commoning outer space as an anti-capitalist project committed to challenging new enclosures and new wasteland can only be realized if it is anti-colonial, and if it discards exploitative material processes and legal tools that enable unequal access to outer space. So how do I do that? I refer to three fundamental texts that haven't so far been put in discussion and in productive engagement with the space studies, and these are Anna Laura Stoller, Imperial Debris, Brenda Bandar's The Colonial Lives of Property, and Max Liboron's Pollution is Colonialism. So my starting point is looking at these texts to reconstruct a postcolonial understanding of the commons in space and the workings, the material, discursive, and legal processes that underpin the construction of space as we have it today. I look at these texts in the context of a political ecology approach, where what is interesting to me is particularly the erosion of environmental resources and the dynamics of accessing it, and how these are nested within a postcolonial context. Okay, so in order to do this work, what I realized pretty quickly was that the idea of pollution needed to be rethought. These also came up in my sort of process of publication when kind of one of the reviewers asked, so we always have one, asked, why do you use the term pollution? Like at a maximum, we are talking about crowding of orbits. It's a little bit of cluttering, but can you really call it pollution? And my answer was yes, I think pollution is the right term. Not only because we use it kind of commonly and the terms are used for debris or waste, junk, and space junk, space waste, and space pollution. Not only because they are the common terms used to identify like the waste that is left outside our planet, but also because that pollution refers to what happens on our planet in the processes of creating space technologies. So I suggest that debris with this talk, I suggest that the debris are the remains and the reminders of highly polluting activities that include the extraction of raw materials on our planet, the industrial processes for manufacturing space objects, and the atmospheric pollution that derives from space launches. So what I'm doing here is basically creating definition that highlights the entanglement of space material, the material pollution in space and the material processes that create the very objects that end up being discarded. Now, as much as I would like to think that this link between like highlighting this entanglement between Earth and space is one of my clever moves, it really isn't. Like, space capitalists have understand that entanglement much better than I do, and that is because space entrepreneurs and space enthusiasts in the new space age often cast outer space commons as the very solution to the Earth's environmental crisis and the supposed scarcity of earthly resources. But at the same time, terrestrial resources, and they know very well that terrestrial resources are extracted and used for the material occupation of the sky. So what I do here is to look at this expansion, this entanglement as an expansion of imaginative, legal, and material practices of land appropriation and use into space. It's an expansion of colonial practices. It's an expansion of, and we will see how, and of legal practices, of legal tools, and discourses about occupation and land appropriation. I just wanted to, on the definitional front, I do use capitalism and colonialism, and I refer to here to Sven and his last work that was After Capital, when I look at the colonial matrix of capitalism, which is then, according to Venn, like based on systematic appropriation and pauperization. Now, when I look at systematic appropriation of space, you will see how I look at that through property, but I also look at systematic appropriation of lands on Earth that allows and enables the material creation of space objects. For pauperization, I look at environmental degradation on our planet, and I look at the ways in which debris basically mortgage more just futures. I don't, in my writing, I used the word foreclosed. I got told off for that because it sounded a little bit like there was no hope. I don't think that there is no hope, but I do think that we are against a big challenge. So, so we've seen that I look at the colonial matrix of capitalism, but accusations of space being space activities being based on colonial and settler logics have been made during the last 5-6 years, and even longer actually. So and they have been made, but particularly in relation to the creation of space facilities on our planet, looking at launch facilities, looking at telescopes, the questions of where are they located and who's dispossessed and who kind of gains from the processes of creating space facilities have been, these are questions that have been raised since the early 2000s. A very important book in this sense was Space in the Tropics, that focuses on the creation of the Ariane space facilities in Peru in French Guyana, and showed that the dispossession of the local communities wasn't met with any kind of real benefit gain that was originally articulated in the creation of the facilities, and that most of the benefits were redistributed in the global north in Europe. So, you know, Europe's launch port being in French Guyana is a clear kind of material impact of a post-colonial way of sort of continuing to gain benefits from earlier histories of colonialism and settler colonialism. DeAndre Smiles is clear in denouncing how even telescopes and the creation of the 30-meter telescopes on Mauna Kea in Hawaii are to be reconducted to and understood within the same settler logic that is based on dispossession and land expropriation. So what I'm suggesting is that understanding colonialism with Le Boiron here is very appropriate for the new space age. Le Boiron's definition of colonialism as the maximum use of resources, dispossession and property as a way to secure settler and colonial futures is a perfect kind of fitting definition for the space age. So while so far we've looked at space facilities, what I am suggesting is that the same sort of the same lens can be applied to an understanding of space objects. And I make this claim also in conversation with the beautiful work of filmmaker Esther Figueroa, whose documentary Fly Me to the Moon has highlighted how the extraction of bauxite from the Cockpit Country in Jamaica has created very real environmental injustices on our planet. And what is particularly interesting, and where I try to kind of like refer back to her work, is how she makes an argument about the interconnectedness of the world through the idea of extraction. And she is very clear on how this is based on a colonial matrix, because the very laws that enable mining in Jamaica, like where in other places of the world, to be fair, are colonial laws that were passed during colonial times and remain active. So these are laws through which people are expropriated, like the Mining Act in Jamaica, through which people are expropriated of their land because of their resources, because the resources can then be extracted. And there is no need for the government to own the land to be able to dispossess the rightful owners and extract the resources, because this is all done within a framework of development. So what I am suggesting is that these connections and the work of Figueroa, Liboiron, root both the space economy and resistance to space extraction in post-colonial and indigenous territories, such as the Cockpit County in Jamaica, but also Linden in Guyana, which is the place where I started from. So in this allows us to think of a double understanding of wasting processes. So these are processes that override the sovereignty of indigenous communities, local communities on this planet, and deplete their territories, and at the same time enable the occupation of orbits or other spaces through material objects that extend and add a different dimension to the crisis. So this process of wasting is based on a double injustice. This is an injustice on our planet and an injustice that calls into question the possibility of other futures. Geographer Julie Klinger refers to the fact that to orbital pollution as a form of environmental injustice, because the polluting activity of one subset of users reduce the accessibility for subsequent parties. So it's a future kind of like it's the creation of an injustice not only for today but for the future. So here we go back to. I'm sorry, I can see that there is stuff in the chat, but I'll have a look at it later, because otherwise I'll lose my thread. But in terms of going back to the three main works that I started with, Anna Lara Stoller, that's where we start to see debris a little bit differently. Like a generic idea of space debris is that they are just the waste of consuming activities of consumption. But what I'm suggesting here is to see them as dynamic, not only because they physically move, which they do, and it has an effect and it's important, but also because they are enmeshed in processes that are active processes. They are processes that are material, that they are discursive, and they are legislative processes that recreate and support these forms of ruination. So Stoller, talking about imperial debris, says, like ruins, debris is constructed and ruination is made. And leftovers are rendered into neglect or valorized for remembrance. I am interested in this dynamic of rendering debris neglect. So we pretend that it's not there. They are just like what's left over, or valorizing them, because what they do is that they remind us of who owns or owned the most of the technologies. And I think it's between this dynamic that I find that there is a lot that can be said and thought through. It's a productive sort of dynamic to think through. So I'm suggesting that debris, once you look at them in that way, can be seen beyond this deterministic idea of waste as the inevitable and so acceptable consequence of consumption. They're not. They are where an object, which was or is a property, depending on what they are. Like if we look at satellites, they are definitely property. If we look at debris as being defunct satellites or parts of satellites or parts of other forms of space technologies, then we need to look at them for what they were and what they represent. So in terms of the legal discourse, a lot of the legal discourse leans towards highlighting the importance of property in outer space as a possibly benefiting the space economy. So one of these articles is Ian Blodge's reclassifying geostationary Earth orbit as private property, which suggests that privatizing portions of orbit is not only justified but desirable. A lot of this discourse in the law goes back to Locke. And you will see in the quote that is on the screen that Blodge says, the satellite is no different from a house built on Earth, since both are bound to a fixed point and improve the area generally. Pouring concrete in an earthbound location is the same kind of action taken by placing a satellite in a location bound to Earth, just further away. Placing a satellite in orbit is similar to transporting materials from one area and erecting them in another location, which does confer a property right under Locke's theory. So here's where the legal and the cultural, the discursive kind of concerns kind of meet with the sort of material actions of placing satellites in orbit. And Locke becomes an important kind of key to understand what sort of discourses are we talking about. Why is this problematic, you may ask? Because starting from Locke and the critiques of Locke that have been leveraged by indigenous scholars like Audra Simpson, we should be reading every reference to Locke through the eyes of how that same discourse enabled the dispossession of indigenous communities on our planet. Now, the issue is not that we are dispossessing indigenous communities somewhere in the cosmos, because that's a common kind of like counterpoint. The issue is that we are using the same legal and material apparatus to continue dispossession of people on our planet and continue forms of environmental ruination. What is this property discourse based on? Is basically the idea that there is a better use of lands, there's a better use of orbit that is only enabled by countries or actors with more advanced technological capabilities. So this discourse effectively locks out of space several constituencies, including countries of the global south. And I will tell you how. This isn't a generic point. Like, I do know that there's a lot of countries from the global south that have satellites in space, but it's an issue of looking at the ratio and looking at the ways in which these have been marginalized. So what I'm suggesting is that we need to keep in mind Brenna Banda's work and her idea of property as being a racial regime. Kind of use that as a way to interrogate the ways in which property is used in outer space. So now I'll give you the example of how historically this idea of property as better use has locked states out of space activities. So let's start by saying that orbits are assigned on a first come, first served type of basis, and that there is usually a time frame in which the claimants or like the states that request kind of a space in orbit need to perfect their requests. So there is a specific time frame. When sovereignty claims to orbital space were made on other kind of bases that were not property, these were effectively denied. So in 1976, there was a declaration made by 7 equatorial countries that's called the Bogota Declaration, where several equatorial states affirmed their sovereignty effectively over portions of the geo. Now, the portions of the geo, because they are at the equator, are directly over their heads, and they're looking at kind of spaces that don't change, and they're kind of like, because of the orbit, sort of, because of the movement being the same as like a rotation of the Earth, like the space remains the same. So they made a claim to continuity between Earth and space, basically saying this portion of geo should be ours because it's always over our head. So the response of the international community was quite stark, and in particular, the UK said that the geo was a part of space, not a part of Earth, and so unavailable to be claimed under the Outer Space Treaty. And other countries, from other European countries like Belgium, insisted that these equatorial states were unable to effectively occupy their geo portion, and so they were unable to perfect those claims under the law. So in that sense, the other countries that had more advanced capability were able to make better use of the orbits than the ones that were claiming these portions of geo. So that's just one example of through which the idea of property enabled like the hegemony within the space sector of older space powers. Now, property and waste are two sides of the same coin, as I hope I have kind of like articulated so far. And reading Max Liboiron's work in this sense highlights that waste is a settler colonial technology that is the evolution of colonial property. So what we're looking here at is a way in which mega constellations, for example, by occupying larger and larger parts of space, are utilizing the idea of property in order to effectively create a state of sovereignty de facto, even if not de jure. So,
sorry, Alan, can I just say if you could start wrapping up? 5 more minutes, thanks.
I will do that. I do have about 5 more minutes to go. So what I have suggested so far is that property is exercised through the right to own, occupy, and waste, and that basically this is antithetical to an ecological ethos that attends to caring for the interconnections within and without, beyond our planet. I've also tried to show that anti-colonialism, framed as resistance to historically created ecological devastation, and anti-capitalism, which fundamentally reject property as a mode of relation, are fundamental to rethinking outer space commons. In that sense, we need to look at space as the commons, not only as like sort of beyond the ways in which the new space age is constructing it, look at the ways in which as a commons it is claimed and enacted in forms of resistance to cosmic capitalism. So I'm looking here particularly at unexpected alliances that are being created by forms of resistance against cosmic capitalism, and that these forms of solidarity need to foreground indigenous decolonization and indigenous resource resurgence. What I'm referring to is the discourse around dark and quiet skies that has seen two different constituencies, astronomers and indigenous communities and indigenous leaders working together in order to make the case for the importance of keeping the skies dark and quiet. While these two constituencies were on opposite sides of the conflict or of the discourse around the creation of the 30-meter telescope in Mauna Kea, and I'm obviously generalizing here. We're not talking about like two kind of monolithic sides, but there were certainly kind of great pushes from the astronomer community to create the telescope on Mauna Kea, and there was great resistance from local indigenous communities in Hawaii. Here we see that against the light pollution from satellites and against the interference of satellites for radio astronomy, what we are seeing is that the two constituencies have kind of like come to dialogues and conversations, and these dialogues have highlighted, even if not in the reports kind of that have gone to the UN, but they have highlighted, at least in the public and the mainstream discourse, how indigenous communities are at the forefront of fighting against environmental pollution outside our planet. There are quotes on the slide that highlight the importance of the night sky for indigenous community from a cultural point of view, but also because, as Hilde Nielsen said, if light pollution is erasing indigenous stories as the indigenous stories are written in the stars, satellites are basically rewriting them. And these communities, did they get a choice? So the question there is, how can we create forms of consultation, forms of discussion, forms of modes of dialogue in which the sovereignty of communities on this planet are taken seriously. So I'll just leave you with the last slide on this idea of commoning and how it's only useful if it foregrounds anti-colonialism and if it highlights existing colonial legacies within the space sector. And what I will say is that I hope that with this talk you have seen how space debris have emerged for me, and through my reading of all these different and disparate kind of works as both a consequence of the colonial occupation of orbit from a small group of space actors and a tool for the occupation in themselves. So this is a form of re-articulation of a racial regime of ownership that is active on a cosmic scale and that has created orbital wastelands and visible changes to the sky. While considering space as a common domain can be a useful starting point to oppose this environmental ruination, it risks falling short of providing anti-colonial strategies for resistance. And that's why we need to think about tackling unequal ownership and wasting of space, and acknowledging that governance proposal based sort of abstractly on common heritage will not bring about more just environmental futures. Instead, we need to restart and take stock of postcolonial and indigenous critiques on reclaiming the commons and think about future-making imaginaries and strategies of commoning outer space that are able to discard coloniality, a generic kind of claim to humanism, and make room for unexpected alliances that challenge the hegemonic orders and ideologies. I hope I've taken a very tiny step in this direction with this talk, and through highlighting how the privileging of economic abstractions over other modes of relating to very complex ecologies and cosmic ecologies has led to the current crowding and pollution of the orbit. Thank you.